to welcome you to the final session at the Cities School, where we have poet and writer Eileen Myles. She currently resides in New York, and she's going to do a reading of her piece of the Liverpool Biennial catalogue twice, which is the name of the piece. And I think she's also going to give us a little clue of some new writings that she hasn't aired yet. So without further ado, Eileen.
Hi. I was sort of in a dead panic. I couldn't find my Diet Coke for a moment. Well, thank you for having me here. This is so great. Great to meet you guys that I don't know. Look at you. So, I just, one of the things I will say that is so terrific about having been invited to contribute to this catalog in this show was that usually when you're asked as a writer to contribute to a biennial or something, you're sent all these like visuals and told what the show is going to look like, and you've got to say something about it. But in this case, there were like a list of words and a number of names, and then would I like to send something in relationship to that? So then it was kind of a bit like I felt like I was being invited to send whatever the hell I wanted that, you know, that had to do with whatever was, you know, rattling around in my own thought process at the time, and several things. One, you know, some of the names that I was given that were inspirational to this biennial were names that were important to me and were personal, and so I could sort of make an essay that I sort of needed to write, you know. So it was kind of a really happy occasion to get to do this and to be part of this, and really, you know, I mean, I do believe as a poet, poetry is like a very stretchy medium. It sort of goes with everything, you know, and so this was an opportunity to kind of, I guess, demonstrate that. So, I don't know, I'm going to read the piece. I guess I'll read the piece first, and then if I feel like I need to read something else, I have a poem. But the thing that's weird is that the poem, it's very strange, the poem sounds like the same person who wrote the essay, and so it's sort of like, it's different, but it feels like more of the same. And so in a way, well, I'll put the essay out and then see if, because as a poet, I feel like, you know, when I was younger, I was like, was sort of a visual artist, like perhaps every child or young person is for a while. And I was more than anything, I was kind of a cartoonist. And when I drew. And when I thought about getting older and what I would do as a career, I thought, well, I could always have a comic strip. You know, it just seemed very easy that would be something like, you know. And except the only problem was that I could never draw the same character twice, you know. And so how would you have a strip? It would just be a one-panel comic strip. And then when I started to write, I kind of had the same problem when I thought about novels. You know, that I would write a surge one day, and then the next day I would sit down to write, and the same person wasn't there anymore, and so I couldn't continue that story. But oddly enough, when I started to write poems, the same person was always there, and so I felt like my poems sort of feel like sort of like vertical comic strips, and this person keeps blocking through her situations, and that person writes essays and poems and novels, and that vertical character taught the novelist in me how to write the same, which is to realize that you don't have to write the same. You just kind of just keep patching things together, and it doesn't have to be the same person. It's the same writer, and that's same enough, you know. So this piece is called Twice. And more than anything, I think it describes in a way that the working life of the artist that is a poet. A friend of mine, Dana, was prowling around in the electronic proof of a journal we are both in, Maggie, edited by another poet friend, Adam, and Dana found my poem, What Tree Am I Waiting?, which I will include here. Now? Well, sure. What tree am I waiting? That whole part of the world, so we're in a poem now, that whole part of the world where I won't go anymore, that whole separation that I won't feel high in this house, in this hemisphere, in this artificial light that is artificial. In the earliest morning, dark, in pages and pens, in an unfamiliar bed, in the foot curl furniture, each rumble when morning comes and it's still morning and it's still night. I married a dead girl. We were born in her bloom. Remember that fat bumblebee landed on a lamp? I opened the doors and I forgot, and the house got colder and colder. Where is this house? The scene between boards merely gains my attention. It's dark and thin. I monitor each situation, my bladder growing full. Climb down, climb up. What tree am I waiting? My whole life in weather, waiting for my raft. I'll fly to another island. I'll take a train. Already I know it will hurt. This is the hurt country. I came here to hold the hurt like a bird, like a tree. Traffic has rings. We watch it whirl around, damaging our night. Great continents hold the feelings and the ages. What is mine going blind? Great masses of them not going home. The country drew a line because of memory. One said, I feel my heart race ahead. In eternity there is this ache, there is this wakefulness. Dana wrote me because he was very excited about this poem. He said he was getting pea-shy, about my own thing, which was a joke since he describes, among other things, taking a piss, and he wonderfully calls his own dick the disaster of the world. His explanation of why my poem was important to him was like balm to my ears. He wrote, to hear someone arrive with that purpose and then put it right there, getting out of the way of everything else to get it right to the top of the thought in the poem, that's the best stuff in the world to me, that sound. It seems harder than ever to do, or I'm confused right now somehow, regardless. It just told in the room for me. This was huge praise from someone whose work I currently adore. I was pea-shy, too, about my own poem in particular. And maybe this is probably totally clear, but part of what's going on is that, and I guess I say this later in the piece, which is that, when you write a poem and then it used to be you'd send it to a magazine, but now increasingly it's a website. And so before the website goes live, there's always this electronic proof. And all the poems are up there together. And so after you've figured out if your own poem has been messed up or is the way you want it, you get to crawl around and look at the other poems. So you get like a preview. So this was huge praise from someone whose work I currently adore. I was pea-shy too about my own poem in particular because it was so emotional. How will it be received? Dana did refer to his own piece in Maggie as a poem. Kind of weirdly. Dana did refer to his own piece in Maggie as a poem, which intrigued me because it looked like prose. It's prose in a world in which I've never really noticed whether people describe Bernadette Mayer's influential early works, moving, and memory, as poems or prose. Didn't she call it writing? I mean, I think even for Lydia Davis, genre is like gender in the poetry world. I'm remembering Amber Hollabar explaining gender this way once. It's not what you're doing, it's who you think you are when you're doing what you're doing. So prose writers in the poetry world always felt less like prose writers to us, more like fellow travelers. And someone like Bernadette was probably writing poems that look like prose, or like Lydia, prose in the poetry world, which for a while at least adds up to the same thing. She was a fellow traveler for a while, and still is, truly, though she's also everybody's now. John Ashbery's greatest book, I think, is 3 poems, which certainly looks like prose. So if Dana Ward wants to call his prosy-looking stuff a poem, it probably has more to do with how he feels about the work, or whose he thinks it is. When I read it, it's mine for sure. I nipped off to his page in Maggie right after I read his email to see what he had in there. His piece with the pissing scene was indeed the one he had emailed to me last summer, both as part of an extended hello and a particular greeting, because his piece was dedicated to Maggie Nelson, who he had just met up at Bard, where they were both visiting teaching. Maggie's one of my favorite people and writers in the world, and I think my name came up while they were talking, and all of this triggered Dana's sending me the piece, because he knew I loved Maggie, and now he did too. And I mention both of them because if there are two youngish, they might be in their early 40s, but that is by now young to me, being 64. Will you still need me? Will you still feed me? No is the answer, but we haven't gotten there yet. If there are two people whose work everyone likes, it is them. Maggie's also a poet who writes loose, splashing, or maybe slashing, speculative prose, and though very different writers, Maggie's more on the balls of her feet, and Dana's loopy, warm, and risk-taking. They both kind of describe a moment in writing in which a lot of things that people like are beginning to need to happen in the same pieces of writing. And those things may be gossip, theory, sexual description, or simply an implication that it's there, or just happened, art. But what's great is that while the most feeling-oriented scholars have been calling for this collusion for a while, it's in the hands and minds and on the computers of poets that all this continental shift is truly happening. Poetry is the new space of possibility, and everyone knows it. Maggie and Dana are two charismatic, and interestingly, both married, wanderers who are working the line between worlds while enjoying the road and packing light. I think part of the method of their madness is security. One thing I want to say also at this moment is that everything I'm describing so far has happened on my computer, or in it. Dana wrote me, and he had visited my poem on his computer. I visited his. I remember encountering his last summer in Italy, I think, and I wrote him back, and then I look at the letter from the Liverpool Biennial, and then I look at Dana's email again, and then I find a couple of poems on my computer, and I begin. So I wrote Dana back last night, and I started to talk about my poem. I don't want to say what I said back to him. I'll try and remember what I meant. I wrote my poem last fall. I had been with my girlfriend in Italy last summer, and then she went back to New York, and then I variously traveled to Lithuania, then Istanbul, and then I called and I wrote her from these places, and finally I arrived in Ireland, where I was to spend the fall. I went to Dublin, Dunleary, specifically, where my friends Allie and Kathleen live, and then we went for a trip down to West Cork, and we took ferries to islands, and we saw two versions of the same play. In one version, because we were late, we had to stand, ears pressed to the wooden door of the community center, under the deep blue sky, and listen to Carmel's play being performed inside. It was a one-woman show in a small space, and we would have entered right in front of the actress, which just wasn't possible. The next night, we were with the playwright herself, Carmel Winters, who was Allie and Kathleen's friend and now mine. Her actress had to go to a wedding that night, so Carmel decided that she would do it herself, which she did in another small community theater on Shirkin Island. We had been feeling her anxiety all day, and I was truly nervous for her, but she was tremendous, even bravely donning the same red running outfit as the actress. It was a dramatization of a film she had earlier produced called Snap, which was about sexual abuse. Pretty riveting and smart. When the writer performs her own text, you can really feel what it means. The timing of the thinking is there. I really don't understand acting at all. I left Kathleen and Allie in a couple of days when they drove me up to Anna-McCarrick, otherwise known as the Tyrone Guthrie Center. Tyrone Guthrie was queer, I learned, and so was his wife. It was a lush retreat with mainly Irish artists. The first night was tough because the acoustics in the dining room were not so great, and everyone had different Irish accents. And everyone spoke really quickly, and spoke even faster when they got to the end, which was invariably a joke, which I didn't get, since I don't know what that word was. On the second night, we all took a walk around the lake, and just as we were approaching the house to hear some music, my cell phone rang. It was my girlfriend. I explained that it wasn't such a good time, and she said, "I think we better speak now." She quickly explained that her playwright friend, Adam, who she had been hanging around with in the month since we'd been apart, was now her lover. I told her that maybe it was a good thing, which she seemed almost angry to hear, but I had this sort of cool, elevated, even relieved feeling. I had been sensing that something was wrong in the couple of weeks before, our calls getting shorter and shorter, and I had even pushed her once about whether she still loved me. Her behavior was so odd, and she sort of slid away from my question and didn't answer. So this was the end of my relationship of 4 years. I sat in the music room with the other artists that night and was serenaded by a variety of songs that seemed consciously chosen to quell and pelt my scrambling soul. Love, love will tear us apart. Peter sang at some point, at which point I heaved myself out of the room sobbing at last, I think. I mean, it was a strange breakup. Does it ever happen by mistake? I think we were meant to break up about that time, but no one could see the way. She found it. I certainly loved her, but I'm old enough to think about that in some ways. Well, so what? There's something else about whether it works, which kind of means, besides loving, can you stand it? I couldn't, but then I could. By October, I was living in Belfast. I promise you, I didn't tell Dana all this. I was living in a little gatehouse to an estate that was no longer there. Instead, it was a gatehouse surrounded by streets and streets of similar brick houses, and there was a leisure center down the hill where I worked out, and a giant Iceland where I bought my food. I had 2 wood-burning stoves, and it was already cold and very wet. I was working on a book. There was a couch that turned into a bed, and in the largest room in the little gatehouse, there was a giant loft bed, and there I lay nightly in hell. I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't stop thinking about my girlfriend and that man. And I thought about how I wished I had broken up with her last summer, or the spring that had just passed, and then I thought about her with that man. And I had even been betrayed before by a girlfriend with a man named Adam. I felt biblical. Who was I? There was a point in suffering, and I mean suffering as a repetition, when you can't sleep or you fall into that bouncy medium stage where softening of sleep is beginning to occur, and then the forbidden thoughts sneak in like a tiny seed that bursts into flame, but white flame, and the blaze feels like day has bombarded the inside of yourself, all light, dripping down all the windows of your heart and your mind, and you look at the ceiling, and you look at the tops of the windows bluing across from you, and you wonder, where in hell are you? Your body goes surge, surge, energy pouring wrongly into all your muscles and joints. You are 100% alive, wrongly. You are so filled with energy, and you'd like to kill, and you don't want to kill yourself. You really don't want to kill anyone. It becomes wordless. It's not even late. It's so early, like about 7 a.m. or 2 a.m. Who knows what time it is? Something happens at this point. What I did tell Dana is that the thing that's so funny about being a poet is that you write sorts of poems. You return to sorts of poems, which are sorts of energy. Each poem that really happens, and by that I mean one that was conjured in a state that managed to find its own rhythm in something deeply anonymous about the self. I think being a poet or a writer, you spend so much of your time processing, consuming, really creating an alternative self that is entirely composed of language, so that there are precise speeds or toxins or organs in it that work in concert with the state that you are in and can only neutralize your own pain by vanishing into a song composed of exactly that timbre or something. I don't know what it is. It's just that I vanished into kind of, not trance, but dictation that utterly resembled the circumstances I found myself in. But by enumerating them, I evacuated even from my own pain and wasn't so much out of my body, but in it in some other way, deciphering the details around me like a breathing tapestry. I wanted to say to Dana that I wrote that one before. Not the poem, but the sort of poem. Tonight I was talking on the phone to Adam, not the playwright Adam who poached my girl, but Adam Fitzgerald, a poet and a confidant, a new dear friend and the publisher of Maggie, which is not named after Maggie Nelson, but nothing feels coincidental, but more incidental. I just wrote him to ask what Maggie means. I was telling him I had been in this exact state another time, and it really, Not so much felt the same, but it was made the same, of the same light. I was having my affair with Bernadette Mayer. You had an affair with Bernadette Mayer? Yes, and her husband. When was this? 1981. I was a young drunk. Well, not so young, kind of the same age my girlfriend was, if you believe in karma. And I don't. No, I don't either. It went on for about 5 months. We weren't friends before, and we weren't friends after. She's tough. I was in love with her. Her husband was in love with me. It kind of ended because she was jealous that he was in love with me. I don't want him. I wanted her. It was absurd. One night when it was all over, or beginning to be over, I was in my apartment, which was about a block away from theirs. There used to be a diner that I would go to in the morning if I wanted to watch her walk to work, or him take the kids to school. And I think Ted Berrigan used to sit there in that same diner after staying up all night doing speed to watch Frank O'Hara hail a cab to work. But I was alone in my apartment in this bluish winter morning. If there was anything to drink, I had already drank it. The window was all fogged, and I taped some pretty Christmas card to the window. It was corny, but it looked really nice. I wanted to copy the window, to be in charge, and we didn't have cell phones yet. I still live in that apartment, and right now, in the web of vines out my window, there is one red leaf that won't fall. It's stuck, and I've tried to take its picture, and you can't. Now it's snowing, so I'm sure it's gone. After I stuck the card on the window, I just became an echo. I vanished into my situation. I think it's the opposite of dramatic. If there's a gland, I've only used it twice to produce a poem. Here's the story, and this is the earlier poem. It's called, And Then the Weather Arrives. I don't know no one anymore who's up all night. Wouldn't it be fun to hear someone really tired come walking up your stairs and knock on your door? Come here and share the rain with me, you. Isn't it wonderful to hear the universe shudder? How old it all, everything must be. How slow it goes, steaming coffee, marvelous morning. The tiniest hairs on the tree's arms coming visible. I like it better, no one knows. Sweetness, moving your lips in silence, closing your eyes all night. It's so much better disarming myself from terror and light passing through a painting I stuck on a window earlier when I was scared. It's great, it's really great. Trees hold the world and the weather moves slow. Even a body dissolves and takes a place incorrectly. Everywhere I would like to nuzzle and plants a heart in the world, voiceless. I began knocking, ridiculous, just to hear your echo back, arm against face. Just to stop those fucking trucks, my thoughts of vanishing into that sweetness. Is it the same poem? It's the same life, the same gone person, feeling so anonymous in her love. I remember the joke Bernadette, her husband, Louis, otherwise he would hate it, and I had, which was what she said as we were breaking up, that she was no one. Now, I guess we had this conversation earlier when we were all in love. She was no one. I said I was anyone. He said it would be nice to be someone. So when I missed her, I wrote, I don't know no one anymore who's up all night. And we did stay up all night at first. Don't lovers always? Wouldn't it be fun to hear someone really tired come walking up your stairs and knock on your door? So he's there too. So I'm the only one that's gone. I'm the only one now up all night by herself. It's sort of like the afterglow of love is this person who can't sleep. And yes, eventually even she has to leave, and that poem is her residue. Just a puddle on the page of what she's felt. Will this happen again? That planet took 32 years to repeat. I don't think there will be another one. Not by this person, no. Not unless my mother dies, and she will. She's 93. She's the one who reminds me of both of these intense orphans, alluring and abandoning. I wrap my life around, and then I get thrown out. This is it, I'm sure. And I'm the baby ghost at the frosty window while the computer plays on. My uncle is a tuber, texts Adam. Spring has a belly. He's explaining the meaning of Maggie. I'm that little red leaf. The storm is over and the leaf is still there. But you know what I mean. I'm directly defecting to that planet's rings. That's it. It felt so much like a literary adventure, I sort of couldn't tell if it was palpable. In fact, I wanted to put it up on a big screen so you could see where I was. You were going to say something. Please.
No, go ahead.
I think that was the end of. Yeah.
I was just going to ask whether anyone has any questions.
What was the list of words that was sent to you as an invitation to write a poem?
Do you remember?
I'm actually here.
Vanessa does. There were abstractions. There were names, and one of them happened to be Bernadette Mayer, and so that was like, aha! I certainly know about Bernadette. I was gossiping about myself from 30 years ago. But there was a list of things that were.
There was the reference to Bernadette Mayer, and also a relation between two people, I think, wasn't it?
Was that relation, was it literally that language? And I think there was some abstractions, like, I don't know, it wasn't like abandonment and discouragement and dereliction, but it seemed like there were a string of things I thought, of course, I write about that all the time.
Yeah.
But then there was a list of people's names, and there was Bernadette, so that was... We can talk about anything. We can talk about your sex lives, in fact.
That's what I wanted to ask you. How, I mean, it's up to you whether you want to answer, but I wanted to know how biographical that what you just read to us was.
Well, utterly. I mean, my ex hasn't seen this, so I'm sure she would argue with some of the. So I think there's always a narrative collapsing. You know, I mean, it's sort of literally what she said on the phone wasn't literally what, so, like you're doing a little job in a way as a writer. But literally, I mean, part of it too, I think the thing about writing a piece of any sort is that there are these excited, like often I think when I'm about to write something, you have pieces of the puzzle, but you don't have the mad chemistry that makes you actually able to cover pages. And so it was just it was so great. It was like the list of things that you guys sent me and the invitation, and then there was a name, and then there was this kind of need to write something, and then it was just like getting an email from this friend about my poem, having a conversation. It's sort of like, so the thing that was, it felt like poetry. So even though, and I think that's the thing that makes you not feel naked, which is weird. It's like the way, I feel like poetry, fiction, nonfiction, I feel like there's no difference, honestly. I think they're all just the act of writing. So even though I was quibbling about that, like, this friend of mine who writes these things that look like prose, and yet he likes to call them poems. Part of it being that he's in the poetry world, so that's the currency that we use, But the thing that always feels uncanny, whether I'm writing an art review or a poem, is when the chemistry occurs, when the 3 or 4 pieces, you suddenly fit the pieces together in some way, and you have that great aha feeling, and the aha occurs before you write the piece, and then you write the piece kind of on that high, and that high feels like an altered state, and that altered state makes something that feels quite naked and quite conventional feel like a truth of another order, and then you feel sort of clothed in your your intention and your kind of excitement, in fact, And of course later, you calm down, you look at the piece you're editing, and then you're even also thinking about other people consuming this and how will they receive this? What will this mean? Who will see this as gossip? Who will see this as aesthetic discussion? Who will see this as what would belong in this catalog? And that felt like an adventure too, to write as a person who does write art reviews, part of the boundaries that I've always been testing is where and how can I get personal when I'm writing about something on the wall or in the room, because often you know, you'll be looking at a piece of sculpture or an installation or something, and somebody walks in the room and says something uncanny, you know, and then you think, can I use this in my review? You know, and often you put it in the review, and then the editor would say, no, you can't say that, or you can't, or another editor will say, that's amazing, because that's so relational, or that's exciting, or that's an actual experience of art being in the room. So I feel like all those questions have been ones that I've been sort of living with since I began to write, and I think certainly when I first began to write, I just simply wanted to write poetry about exactly what it was that I was experiencing. And I teach writing, and we're always trying to teach people to not do that, or find some way to do that and not do that. You know, it's like you're always doing a bait and switch. It looks like gossip, but it's, you know, it's actually aesthetics. You know, but no, it's actually gossip. You know. I think we have to give a moment of silence because I know there are other questions.
I'd like to know a bit more about what other, I mean, so you write reviews, art reviews, and you write poetry, prose work. I think we'd all be interested to know how it all fits together and whether that piece was something you would have written. It sounds like it was, in spite of the kind of trigger that the invitation had, because you were obviously in Ireland, you were on the residency.
We were just talking about this before, yeah.
Be interesting to know how things fit together, because it sounds like you're on some kind of...
How they fit together, when and where, is your, I'm not sure I understand. I almost understand.
In the kind of, how, you know, the different aspects of your practice as a writer, I suppose.
Well, I think they're always, I mean, in a way, all writing is occasional, you know? I mean, like, even an intention, like, I decide I'm writing a novel, so what we call this thing that I'm doing is a novel, you know, as opposed to I've been asked to write this essay, you know, or I'm commissioned to review this piece. But the thing is, after it's written, it can then become something else. That too, like often I've written things for an anthology or and then it winds up being a piece of a novel. You know, I mean, it's like, I mean, part of it too being if you have, you know, like if you have this orientation towards changing, wanting the forms to change, and wanting them to all becoming, there are certainly traditional novelists who will, you know, or traditional editors who are like, where's the arc? Where's the narrative? Where's the redemptive moment? You know, and the book is crap if it doesn't deliver these kind of capitalist narratives. You know, but I think those of us who've been working in forms and anti-forms and I mean, I think even terms like hybridity seem really old-fashioned to me. You know, it seems like, why can't I just put, it's like, do you know those Dr. Seuss animals that there used to be a great kids toy that I was too old for, but it was my favorite toy in my house, where it was just like there was a torso of an animal and legs of another animal, and you could just keep reassembling other animals and stuff. And I feel like literature is like that, and so there's maybe a fixed purpose, but there's no fixed destination. You know, so for me, my greatest delight is to write something for one reason and then later slip it in as like, you know, like somebody was doing an anthology on women and adventure, you know, and I had gone to Hawaii to do a reading, and when I was in Hawaii, you know, you go to certain places and people ask you certain questions, and people were like, are you going to go to the Big Island? No, you know, what the hell is the Big Island? And it turns out that's Hawaii. You know, there's a bunch of islands, and the biggest one is Hawaii. And there they have the volcanoes, and even live volcanoes in the national park, you know. So once I heard there was that, you know, I thought, how can I get to see that, you know? And I worked it all out and got a little motel and a little plane and did it all, and then thoroughly fucked it up. Like, I went to the state park with my little rental car and asked the state trooper, you know, when do we see the lava bursting out of the volcano into the sea? And he was like, he said something about the dark and da-da-da-da and bring water and light, and I sort of memorized everything in my wrong way. And so what I wound up doing is going out on this long lava bed that went out to a cliff over the sea when it was beginning to be dark. And in fact, that was the opposite of what you were supposed to come back when it was dark. So as I was going out on it, all these people were coming towards me, you know, and families and couples, and they were like, what are you doing, you know? But nonetheless, you know, and it was harrowing, and I wound up, you know, because it was increasingly dark, and there was like steam coming up from the lava, like I felt like a cartoon character, you know, I was like, woo, you know, hooting, but I got out there and had like the most sublime experience I'd ever had, which was that I was sitting on a cliff over the ocean watching lava fall into the ocean, and it was just like, you couldn't think about anything else. It was so, I thought, oh, this is what the sublime means, you know, this is, and so I wrote this essay, and then later I was working on a novel and about a poet, and it just seemed like, oh my, you know, of course this is the way to end that whole section in the chapter in which the poet has the sublime adventure in nature, you know, and I sort of slid it in later, and it was, you know, it was just, in a way, like writing is your own series of private jokes. You're like, this is really great, you know, that I get to use this as that. And, you know, in this essay, too, it's like now I'm, I'm putting together a selected poems that's coming out next year. And writing this changed the title of that book, and now this is the afterword to that book, because both the poem from 30 years ago and the poem from last year are both in the book. And even though poets don't traditionally write introductions to their own selected poems talking about their sex lives, I think it's kind of radical in a way, and I do talk about aesthetics, so it's like this total gift that the Liverpool Biennial gave my selected poems, you know. So I think there's a real pleasure in how these pieces morph all the time, you know. A longing for one more question. Who was weirded out? Anybody weirded out by what I wrote? You kind of, I hate poetry, or why would you write about that, or something about what sign you are, or what.
There was something that you said about kind of the half poem. I can't remember exactly what you said. You said there's always.
Could you yell it out a bit?
You said something about half poems that are just kind of left and you can go back to them, did you say?
Half poems?
Yeah, maybe you said something about poetry being these, or the writing being these little things you can come back to. No way, well that was one of my questions back to front, really.
But keep going, yeah.
Are you asking, do you sometimes kind of leave works kind of unfinished and revisit them later to finish them or form them in a different way?
Yeah. But more than anything, I think fine. But I know that there's something specific.
There was something specific that you said, and now it's
in the essay, or what I just said.
Yeah, in your essay.
Can you remember what was around it?
No, it was something like that. Sorry.
Damn. Also, there is an astrological, there's a thing called Saturn return. I don't know if you guys are into astrology, but there's this thing, the Saturn return, which is like you're in 28, 29, and supposedly Saturn goes around that many, you know, it takes Saturn 29 years to go around, and so it's like the myth of rock stars dying at 27, or Keats dying at that age, and it's sort of like supposedly people don't want to go into, you know, rotten adulthood, and so you kind of die before your Saturn returns, so your kind of life becomes a first surge sort of thing, you know. But in fact, I mean, you actually have another Saturn return, you know, like at 58 or something like that. You don't hear about it. It's like less romantic. It's like nobody wants to turn 58. Turning 28 is sort of fine, you know. But what's weird is that even that in there, in this essay, it's sort of like that. Both those poems landed in those spots, so they're really like Saturn return poems. And you know, if you look at medieval stuff about astrology, they really addressed it to the humors and organs of the body and stuff. And so, in a way, I feel like there's some real truth to it. You know, that you do kick out things very slowly from your physical self and your, you know, the mental, you know, aspect of that, you know, we're like these clocks that we just, I mean, part of poetry is, I mean, that's one of the things that's really true. We're all writing is that it's prophetic, and I don't mean to get all woo-woo about it, but it's like anything you do all the time starts to become like a method of divination. So, like, for instance, if you write a poem, if you decide that I'm going to write a poem from, you know, the beginning of the summer to the end of the summer, you know, just as an endurance or a duration thing. What will happen, it's just like turning on, it's like sitting in that doorway with a camera. things will go by that doorway that you would have never, that are absolutely uncanny. And truly the time itself or the doorway itself seems to change, you know, or that summer is like a summer you've never had before. It's almost like the world starts performing because you're watching it and writing a poem, you know. So there's this kind of magical thing that has to do just with the process of beginning to be a person who is just taking down and writing and writing and writing, and it starts to become your sort of magical space. And so it is a kind of, it's like a clock, and it's like a river of.
Like a diary?
Well, it's literally a diary, but it's something, I think it's deeper than a diary, and I think it's older than language even, I think, you know. I mean, it's sort of like one of the, a friend of mine, a writer and a translator by the name of David Rattray, he died of brain cancer, and he was like one of the most brilliant people I know, and he had that death that we all, you know, it's like so romantic and horrifying, where he just was, he had a headache, and he stumbled, and his wife took him to a doctor, and the doctor said, you should get a brain scan, and he had a brain scan, and they were like, we need to give you surgery next week, and then next week they took out a big tumor, and they said, you've got 2 months to live, and he died in 2 months. And so in those 2 months, you know, it was that thing, if you have ever known somebody who's dying, and you go to them on a regular basis and stuff, and he just would tell me things, and I would tell him, you just run out of, you just keep coming up with more things to say, you've got to keep talking and stuff. And I was telling him something really ludicrous about myself, which was, when I was 19, I was always trying to starve, and I was on that sort of alcoholic, binging and starving kind of routine. And so I started to have a strange feeling about time and food. And I had this, my way of thinking about time was that it was sort of like, if you go into a swimming pool and you dive under the water, and it's all sort of gray, but you see the ladder, and there's those rungs, you know, and I sort of started to think of a day like that those rungs were like food, you know, and those were the solid things to hold on to, and the rest was all kind of floaty. And so I'm telling David this for some reason, and he goes, that's really interesting, because one theory of how language was invented was that it was in Egypt, and there was like the Nile, you know, the river, and that the river was commerce, you know, and it was like, that was where all the goods transported, that's where all the business was conducted on the river, things were moved. And they finally just came to a point where they realized they needed some way to both account for what was coming, you know, like how many jugs of wine and how many goats, and also a guarantee that it was coming, you know? And so it's sort of like that literally, and so it really literally looked like that ladder. It's like the parchment represented the river, and the marks on it, i.e. language, represented accounting and divination, you know? And so you right away, writing itself was like this magical process, you know, that the future, not just jugs of wine, but that indeed the future is coming, you know, which never was true before. You know, language kind of fucked everything up, but then created this other order that we live in, you know. But I think part of what goes on when you write is you actually are doing something deeper than language, you know. That's why it's magic.
It sounds like you use systems or structures, like deciding to write a poem that starts at the beginning of the summer and ends at the end of the summer, or like you said, you know, looking through a doorway every day. And so, do those kind of systems, is that kind of the basis, the starting point for you as a general rule?
You make it up. You absolutely make it up. And this, you know, the phenomena of the poetry workshop, which is that you go to the workshop and they say, we're all going to write a poem. The first line has the word yellow. And then we're all going to, you know, write a dirty secret. And that'll be the second line. And then, you know, I mean, like, you just spend several years, or that's what MFA programs, poetry, or just somebody is like giving you jumps, you know, and then what happens is the career of a poet is making up jumps for yourself. You just spend the rest of your life making up jumps, you know, like I wanted to write a poem about, a novel about being a poet, so it was just like, I thought about being in college and having fallen in love with a professor who assigned us the Inferno. And I thought, oh, okay, so I'll write a novel that's about being a poet, but it's also about being a lesbian, and I'll kind of use Dante's Inferno, and then, but in some really, 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 really loose way. But then, you know, but it's, that people use other literary forms and locations and, a friend of mine died once, and I usually need to take some time before I can write about some incidents, or, I use real incidents all the time in my writing, but usually this needs to be poetry can be right away, but fiction needs to wait. But this man who was a famous poet, who I used to be his assistant, a guy named James Schuyler, I just felt like I just wanted to get it out instantly. So I had an orange chair in my apartment, and so I just made a rule for myself. I put a legal pad, a paper next to the orange chair, and just decided that every time I came into my apartment, I would sit down on the orange chair and write a paragraph of the story. And that's how I wrote the story,
I actually have a question. I think you've kind of vaguely touched upon this as you've been answering the questions, because it's more specific. You now have quite a vast and formidable body of work behind you. What is it that we've touched upon, kind of astrology and putting structures in your life that inspire you or even force you to create? When you get, say, a brief, say, like biennial brief, do you find that constricting, or do you quite like having a bit of structure? So do you feel more inspired when you're working, on your own self-direction, or do you kind of enjoy getting a bit of bringing things together and confining what you have to write?
Well, I think you kind of resent the stricture until something kicks in that makes it. In a way, it's sort of like it's like being rebellious. You've got to find a way to. If somebody asks you to do something, you've got to find a way to do it that sort of fucks with them, or amuses you, or it's sort of like you basically turn. I think I wouldn't do this work if it wasn't play, if it wasn't fueling some need in me to break things and undo things and kind of be, going through the mirror and suddenly being in that other room that always seemed so magical, and now my house, So I think that sort of the stricture, some strictures you just, I'll do that, and you just never get to it, or you can't get to it, or you won't get to it. But often it's just like, it's sort of like you kind of sit with it until it makes you itchy, and then you start to scratch it, and then there's something there, So I think there's no such thing as just doing your own writing and being natural, and it just doesn't exist. People have different ways. Like I know, novelist friends who are like, I don't use my own life. But if you know them and you look at their novels, you're like, come on, that's like ridiculous, And it's just that people have different needs for different veils, different levels of disguise and abstraction, and different kinds of assemblage, But I think there's both reality, and then there's these other kind of prompts, or what was the word you used? A note? Anyway, whatever the biennial gave me, or
The brief.
a brief. Yeah. Everything is a limitation, right? That's what we're doing here, is feeling deeply limited by the fact that it's 8 o'clock or something. Exactly. Yeah, we have to get out of the building, or else we have to pay the guards extra or something. And we need to go to dinner, we have a reservation. So we're all confined wildly. Yeah. Thank you.